October 2024. The air hung heavy over the Appalachian ridges. A construction crew breaking ground for a new shopping plaza on the outskirts of Beckley, West Virginia, struck something that wasn't bedrock. Beneath 3 feet of compacted red clay and wild kudzu vines, a backhoe blade scraped against rusted metal. The roof of a 1998 silver Honda Accord, license plate visible through the mud. WV4729L. The vehicle had been buried intentionally, hidden under what was once an abandoned coal loading site. Inside, forensic teams would find 2 sets of remains: a woman's wedding ring still circling a bone, and a child's pink backpack with the name Natasha stitched in fading purple thread. For 24 years, Susan Carter and her 10-year-old daughter had been missing. The community assumed they'd fled an abusive marriage, started over, somewhere far from the cold, dust air of southern West Virginia. But the truth had been right beneath their feet all along, sealed in silence, waiting for a blade to cut through the earth and finally let them speak. Who buried them? And why did it take a quarter century for the ground to give up its secret? Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and the algorithm gods will make sure you don't miss any future uploads. October 2024. The air hung heavy over the Appalachian ridges, thick with morning fog and the metallic scent of coming rain. Beckley, West Virginia, a town carved from coal seams and hard labor, prepared for another winter. On the eastern edge of town, where old railyards once transported black diamonds from mountain bellies, a construction crew arrived before dawn to break ground on a new shopping plaza. The site had been abandoned for decades, a former coal loading station overgrown with kudzu vines, wild sumac, and red clay hardened by 24 years of Appalachian weather. Tommy Briggs, the excavator operator, climbed into his Caterpillar 320 at 6:47 a.m., the diesel engine coughing to life in the cold. His job was simple: clear the top 3 feet of compacted earth, level the site, prepare it for concrete. The backhoe's steel blade bit into the red Virginia clay, pulling up chunks of rock, twisted roots, and rusted metal scraps, remnants of the railyard's industrial past. For 2 hours, the work was routine. Then, at 8:52 a.m., the blade struck something that didn't sound like stone. Metal. Hollow. Large. Briggs killed the engine. Silence rushed back into the valley, broken only by the distant cough of crows circling overhead. He climbed down from the cab, boots sinking into the muddy trench his machine had carved. Beneath a tangle of roots and clay, something silver glinted in the weak morning light. He crouched, brushing dirt away with gloved hands. Paint rusted, but unmistakably automotive paint. A license plate emerged, caked in mud but legible. WV4729L. His pulse quickened. Briggs pulled his phone from his jacket and dialed the site foreman. Within 20 minutes, Beckley police arrived. Their cruisers parked at odd angles along the muddy access road. By noon, the West Virginia State Police had cordoned off the entire area with yellow tape. Forensic technicians in white Tyvek suits moved carefully around the half-buried vehicle, photographing, measuring, documenting every angle. The backhoe sat idle nearby, its blade still dripping red clay. The vehicle was a 1998 Honda Accord, silver, 4-door. It had been buried deliberately, positioned horizontally in a trench approximately 6 feet deep, then covered with layers of clay, gravel, and topsoil. The roof had been crushed inward, whether from the weight of earth or intentional damage. Forensic engineers couldn't yet determine, but the license plate was enough. A records check came back within minutes. Registered owner, Susan Marie Carter. Last known address, Beckley, WV. Status, missing person, March 2000. The name meant nothing to the younger officers, but for those who'd worked Raleigh County in the early 2000s, it was a ghost rising from cold case files. Susan Carter, 41 years old, and her daughter Natasha Carter, 10, had vanished without a trace on March 12, 2000. The case had been filed as a voluntary disappearance. A woman fleeing an abusive marriage, taking her child and starting over, somewhere beyond the mountains. No body, no crime scene, no evidence of foul play, just an empty trailer, a missing car, and a husband who swore his wife had run away. Now, 24 years later, the car had been found, and it wasn't empty. Forensic teams used hydraulic jacks to carefully lift the yellow cord's crushed frame. working slowly to preserve any evidence still clinging to metal and upholstery. When the driver's side door was finally pried open, the smell hit them first. Not decay which had long since passed, but the earthy mineral scent of bones and soil fused together over decades. Inside, partially buried in sediment that had seeped through rusted seams, were 2 sets of remains. In the driver's seat, an adult female, skeletal clothing fragments still visible. Denim, synthetic fabric, the remnants of a floral print blouse. On the 3rd finger of her left hand, a thin gold wedding band, tarnished green but intact, circled a bone. In the back seat, smaller remains. A child. Fragments of a pink backpack lay beside the bones. The nylon fabric rotted, but still recognizable, stitched into the fabric in fading purple thread. Natasha, a forensic technician, a woman in her 50s who'd worked dozens of cold cases, knelt beside the open door and stared at the name. She didn't speak. Behind her, a younger officer turned away, hand over his mouth. The site had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. By late afternoon, the West Virginia State Medical Examiner's van arrived, and the remains were carefully lifted, each bone catalogued, each fragment of clothing bagged and tagged. Preliminary examination would take weeks, but the wedding ring and the backpack left little doubt. Susan and Natasha Carter hadn't fled. They'd been here all along, buried beneath what had once been a forgotten industrial lot, sealed in silence under layers of Appalachian earth. That evening, as the sun set over the ridges and cast long shadows across the excavation site, a single detail emerged that turned the case from tragedy to homicide. The rear doors of the Honda Accord had been welded shut from the outside. Crude, rough welds, done hastily but effectively. Someone had sealed them inside and then buried them alive. Or just after death, the ground had finally opened, and after 24 years, Susan and Natasha Carter could speak again. March 2000. Southern West Virginia still carried winter in its bones, though the calendar promised spring. The mountains around Beckley remained bare, their slopes a patchwork of grey hardwood and dark evergreen. Fog settled into the hollows each morning, thick and cold, reluctant to lift until nearly noon. In the trailer park on Dry Branch Road, a narrow gravel path winding through scrub pine and muddy lots, life moved at the rhythm of shift work, disability checks, and the slow erosion of Coal Town prosperity. Susan Marie Carter lived in Lot 14, a single, wide trailer with faded blue siding and a small wooden deck that sagged on one corner. She was 41 years old, though neighbors often said she looked older, the kind of aging that comes not from years, but from weight carried too long. Her face was narrow, her eyes pale blue and often tired. She wore her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hands, rough from years of work, were never without small cuts or dry skin that no amount of lotion could soften. She worked as a cashier at the Save AOT grocery store on Harper Road, a job she'd held for nearly 7 years. Her shifts ran from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., 5 days a week, sometimes 6 when they needed extra coverage. Managers described her as reliable, quiet, never late. She didn't socialize much with co-workers, didn't attend the occasional Friday night gatherings at the bowling alley. When her shift ended, she clocked out, walked to her silver Honda Accord in the employee lot, and drove the 4 miles back to Dry Branch Road. Her daughter, Natasha Lynn Carter, was 10 years old in March 2000. She attended Beckley Elementary, a low brick building with a chain-link fence around the playground. Teachers described her as shy, withdrawn, the kind of child who sat at the back of the classroom and rarely raised her hand. But when she did speak, she was polite, careful with her words, as if measuring each syllable for safety. Her favorite subject was art. She loved to draw horses, wild horses running across open fields, their manus flowing, hooves never touching the ground. Her teacher, Mrs. Patricia Holcomb, kept one of Natasha's drawings pinned to the bulletin board for months, a pencil sketch of a mare and foe standing beneath a tree. Natasha had her mother's pale eyes and narrow face, but her hair was lighter, almost blonde in summer. She wore second-hand clothes, jeans with patches on the knees, sweatshirts a size too large. Her backpack was pink, decorated with fabric markers, her name stitched in purple thread by her mother's hand. Inside she carried schoolbooks, a battered notebook filled with horse drawings, and a small stuffed bear named Charlie, its fur worn smooth from years of being held. The trailer on Lot 14 was small but clean. Susan kept it that way. The kitchen smelled of dish soap and cheap coffee. A crocheted blanket, faded yellow, draped over the back of the couch. On the refrigerator, held by magnets, were Natasha's drawings. Horses. Always horses. The walls were thin, the kind that let every sound travel from one end of the trailer to the other, which meant the neighbors heard everything. Michael Joseph Carter, Susan's husband, was 44 years old. He'd worked in the coal mines for 15 years before a back injury forced him onto disability in 1997. He was a large man, broad-shouldered with calloused hands, and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. He spent most days at home, or at Smokey's Bar on Route 3, a cinder-block building with neon beer signs in the windows. He drank Budweiser, played pool, and complained loudly about his pain, his back, his useless doctors, and his wife, who didn't appreciate a goddamn thing. Neighbors on Dry Branch Road knew Michael Carter's voice well. It carried through the thin trailer walls on too many nights. Loud, slurred, angry. They heard glass breaking, doors slamming, Susan's voice, quieter, pleading, and sometimes Natasha crying. No one called the police. That wasn't how things worked in the trailer park. People minded their business. They turned up their TVs, closed their windows, and pretended not to hear. But Carol Jenkins, who lived in Lot 12, 2 trailers down, noticed more than most. She was a retired nurse, a heavy-set woman with gray hair and sharp eyes. She saw the bruises on Susan's arms when she carried groceries in from her car. She saw Natasha walking to the school bus stop, shoulders hunched, eyes down. One morning in late February 2000, Carol stopped Susan as she was loading her daughter into the Honda. "You all right, honey?" Carol asked, her voice low. Susan forced a smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "Fine. Just tired." Carol didn't believe her, but Susan drove away before she could say more. At Beckley Elementary, the school nurse, Linda Moss, documented concerns in Natasha's file. On February 8, 2000, bruise on left forearm, approximately 2-inch dark purple. Student states she fell off bike. On February 22nd, bruise on right shoulder blade, visible through shirt during gym class. Student became upset when asked, refused to explain. The notes were filed. A social worker was supposed to follow up, but caseloads were heavy, and Beckley's Department of Health and Human Resources was understaffed. The follow-up never happened. Susan knew she had to leave. She'd known for years, but knowing and doing were separated by a canyon of fear and logistics. Where would she go? How would she afford rent? Michael controlled their bank account. She had $240 in cash hidden in a coffee can behind the water heater. She'd been adding to it slowly. $5 here, $10 there, whenever she could skim from grocery money without him noticing. In early March, she confided in her sister, Margaret Hayes, who lived 30 meters away in Princeton. They met at a McDonald's parking lot, sitting in Susan's car, while Natasha ate a Happy Meal in the back seat. "I'm going to leave him," Susan said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't do this anymore. He's getting worse." Margaret gripped her sister's hand. "You can stay with me, both of you. Pack a bag, leave tonight." Susan shook her head. "He'll find me. You know he will. I need to plan it right. Get far enough away that he can't follow." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Susan, please. Just come now." 2 weeks, Susan said. "Give me 2 weeks. I'll get my taxes back. I'll have enough for a deposit on an apartment somewhere. Maybe North Carolina. Maybe Ohio." Margaret didn't want to wait, but she nodded, because she knew her sister's fear was real. Michael Carter had a temper, and he'd made it clear more than once that if Susan ever tried to leave, he'd make sure she regretted it. On March 10, 2000, 2 days before she disappeared, Susan withdrew $180 from the bank. Her tax refund, early deposited. She told the teller she was buying Natasha new school clothes. She drove to a Goodwill store and bought a duffel bag, 2 changes of clothes for herself, 3 for Natasha. She hid the bag in the trunk of her car beneath a wool blanket and a spare tire that had never been used. That same evening, she made Natasha's favorite dinner, spaghetti with butter and Parmesan. No sauce, because Natasha didn't like tomatoes. They ate together at the small kitchen table, while Michael sat in the living room, half asleep in his recliner, an empty beer can on the armrest. Susan watched her daughter twirl noodles on her fork, her small face serious, concentrated. "Mama, Natasha said quietly. Are we going somewhere? Susan's breath caught. What makes you ask that? I saw the bag in the car. Susan reached across the table, touching her daughter's hand. Maybe. Someday soon. Would you like that? Natasha nodded, her eyes wide and hopeful. Can we go somewhere with horses? Susan smiled. And for the first time in months, it was real. Yeah, baby. Somewhere with horses. 2 days later, they were gone.
Capítulo 3. O Desaimento. March the 12th, 2000 Sunday. The sky over Beckley was low and grey, threatening rain that wouldn't come until after dark. Temperatures hovered in the low 40s, cold enough that breath hung visible in the morning air. The mountains remained wrapped in fog that refused to lift, clinging to the hollows like something unwilling to let go. It was the kind of day that felt suspended, neither winter nor spring caught between seasons. Susan Carter woke at 6:30 a.m., as she always did, even on Sundays. The trailer was quiet. Michael had come home late the night before, sometime after midnight, smelling of cigarettes and beer. He was still asleep in their bedroom, snoring heavily, the sound carrying through the thin walls. Susan moved carefully, avoiding the spots on the floor that creaked. She made coffee in the small kitchen, standing at the counter while it brewed, staring out the window at the grey morning. Natasha emerged from her room at 7:15, still in her pajamas, faded pink with cartoon bears. Her hair was tangled from sleep, and she carried Charlie the stuffed bear tucked under one arm. Susan poured her a bowl of cereal, Cheerios with milk, and sat with her at the table while she ate. They didn't talk much. The morning felt fragile, as if speaking too loudly might shatter something. At 9 a.m., Michael woke. They heard his footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving from the bedroom to the bathroom. The water ran. The toilet flushed. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, his face unshaven and eyes bloodshot. Coffee, he said, not looking at Susan. She poured him a cup, black, and set it on the counter. He drank it standing, staring out the same window she'd been watching earlier. For a moment, the three of them existed in tense silence. Susan at the table, Natasha spooning cereal slowly, Michael at the counter. Then he spoke. I'm going out, he said. Ray's working on his truck. Said he needs help. Susan nodded. Okay. Michael grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door, patted his pockets for his wallet and cigarettes, and left without another word. The door slammed behind him. Through the window, Susan watched his pickup truck, a rusted Ford F-150, pull out of the gravel driveway and disappear down Dry Branch Road. She waited 5 minutes. Then she turned to Natasha. Get dressed, baby. We're going out. Natasha looked up, eyes wide. Where? Just for a drive. Maybe get ice cream. It was too cold for ice cream and Natasha knew it. But she didn't argue. She went to her room and changed into jeans, a purple sweatshirt, and her worn sneakers. Susan pulled on her own jeans, a floral print blouse, and her denim jacket. She grabbed her purse from the counter, checked inside, wallet, keys, the $240 in cash, folded into a small envelope. Her hands were shaking. At 10:05 a.m., Susan and Natasha left the trailer. Carol Jenkins, the neighbor in Lot 12, was outside sweeping her small porch. She waved as Susan backed the silver Honda Accord out of the driveway. Susan waved back, a smile tight and brief. Carol would later tell police that Susan looked nervous, distracted, not herself, but at the time she thought nothing of it. The drive into Beckley took 12 minutes. Susan drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, checking her rear-view mirror more often than necessary. Natasha sat in the back seat, her pink backpack on her lap, Charlie the bear tucked inside. She stared out the window at the grey mountains, the bare trees, the occasional house set back from the road. At 10:23 a.m., Susan pulled into the parking lot of a 7-Eleven on Harper Road, 2 blocks from the Save, a lot where she worked. Security footage, grainy and time-stamped, captured the silver Honda pulling up to pump 3. Susan got out, swiped her debit card, and began filling the tank. Natasha remained in the back seat, visible through the rear window. Susan's face, caught in profile by the camera, looked drawn and pale. She kept glancing toward the road, as if watching for someone. After the tank was full, Susan went inside. The clerk on duty, a young man named Derek Palmer, 19 years old and working weekends to pay for community college, remembered her clearly. She bought a pack of Marlboro Lights, though she rarely smoked, a bottle of water, and a bag of Skittles for Natasha. She paid in cash. When Derrick handed her the change, he noticed her hands were trembling. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked. Susan looked at him startled, as if she'd forgotten he was there. "Fine. Just cold." She took the plastic bag and left. Derrick watched her walk to the car, get in, and sit for a moment before starting the engine. She didn't leave right away. She sat there, hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. Then at 10:31 a.m., she pulled out of the parking lot and turned east on Harper Road, heading toward Route 3. That was the last confirmed sighting of Susan and Natasha Carter. Derek Palmer's testimony would become critical years later. But in March 2000, it was just another transaction, another customer on another Sunday morning. The security footage was kept for 30 days, then recorded over. The receipt was filed in a box with thousands of others. No one thought to preserve it. By noon, Michael Carter was still at Ray Dawkins's house, a small cinder-block home 3 miles from the trailer park. Ray, a wiry man in his 50s with grease-stained hands and a crooked smile, was indeed working on his truck, a Chevy Silverado with a busted transmission. Michael helped him lift the transmission jack, held tools, and drank the beers Ray kept pulling from a cooler on the porch. They worked until nearly 3 p.m. when Michael said he needed to get home. "Susan's probably got dinner started," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. Ray nodded. "Tell her I said, hey." Michael drove home, the Ford F-150 rattling over gravel roads, and pulled into Lot 14 at 3:17 p.m. The silver Honda Accord was not in the driveway. The trailer was dark. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, expecting to hear the TV or Natasha's voice or the sound of something cooking on the stove. Silence. "Susan," he called. No answer. He walked through the trailer. The kitchen was clean, dishes from breakfast still in the drying rack. The living room was empty. He checked the bedrooms. Natasha's room was neat, her bed made, her drawings pinned to the walls. His and Susan's bedroom was the same as he'd left it that morning. He opened the closet. Susan's clothes were still there. Her winter coat, her boots, the duffel bag he'd seen her buy days earlier was gone. But most of her belongings remained. In Natasha's room, he noticed something odd. Her favorite stuffed bear, Charlie, the one she carried everywhere, was sitting on her pillow. She never left without it. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, then set it back down. Michael went to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. A note written in Susan's handwriting on a torn piece of notebook paper was magnetized to the door. "Michael, I can't do this anymore. I'm taking Natasha. Don't come looking for us, Susan." He read it twice. Then he crumpled it in his fist, tossed it onto the counter, and opened a beer. He sat on the couch staring at the blank TV screen and didn't move for an hour. At 6:30 p.m., as dusk settled over the mountains, Margaret Hayes called the trailer. She'd been trying Susan's cell phone all afternoon, but it kept going to voicemail. When Michael answered the landline, his voice was flat. "She's gone," he said. "What do you mean gone?" "She left, took Natasha, said she couldn't do this anymore." Margaret's heart sank. "Michael, where did she go?" "Hell if I know. Left a note. Didn't say where. Did you call the police?" Michael laughed. A short, bitter sound. "Why would I? She left on her own. That's what the note says." Margaret's hands tightened around the phone. "Michael, I'm coming over. Suit yourself." She drove to Beckley that night, her husband beside her, and arrived at the trailer just after 8:00 p.m. Michael let them in, his face expressionless. The note was still on the counter. Margaret read it, then looked around the trailer. Everything felt wrong. Susan's purse was gone, but her makeup bag was in the bathroom. Her favorite jacket was still in the closet. Natasha's bear was on the bed. "She wouldn't leave without Charlie," Margaret said, holding the stuffed animal. "Natasha never goes anywhere without this." Michael shrugged. "Maybe she forgot. You don't forget your kid's favorite toy. Maybe she was in a hurry." Margaret turned to face him. "Where's her car?" "Don't know. She took it. Have you looked for them?" Michael's eyes hardened. She's a grown woman. She made her choice. Margaret wanted to scream. Instead, she called the Beckley Police Department from the trailer's landline. A dispatcher answered, took her information, and promised to send an officer. At 9:42 p.m., Officer Jason Trent arrived, a young patrolman in his late 20s. He took statements from both Michael and Margaret, examined the note, and walked through the trailer with a flashlight. "Any signs of struggle?" he asked. Michael shook his head. "No, she just left." Officer Trent turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, has your sister talked about leaving before?" Margaret hesitated. She was unhappy, but she wouldn't just disappear without telling me. Did she have money? Access to funds? Not much. Maybe a few hundred. Officer Trent noted everything in his report. He explained that without evidence of a crime, there was little the police could do. An adult leaving with her child, especially if there was a note, wasn't grounds for an immediate investigation. He suggested filing a missing persons report if Susan hadn't made contact within 48 hours. Margaret felt her chest tighten. 48 hours? My sister could be anywhere by then. I understand, ma'am, but legally she's an adult who left voluntarily. Michael stood in the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. Officer Trent left at 10:30 p.m., promising to file his report and pass it to detectives. Margaret stayed at the trailer that night, sleeping on the couch. Though she barely slept at all, she kept thinking about the bear on Natasha's bed, the jacket in the closet, the makeup bag in the bathroom, all the small things Susan would have taken if she were really planning to start over somewhere new. The next morning, March 13th, Margaret filed an official missing persons report at the Beckley Police Department. The clerk took down the information. Susan Marie Carter, 41, white female, brown hair, blue eyes, approximately 5.4, 130 Sawadril Bow. Natasha Lynn Carter, 10, white female, blonde hair, blue eyes, approximately 48, 70 Lobi. Vehicle, 1998, Honda Accord Silver, West Virginia license plate, WV47M29L. The report was logged entered into the National Crime Information Center database. And then it sat, because without evidence of foul play, without signs of abduction, it was just another domestic case. A woman leaving her husband, taking her daughter, disappearing into the wide American landscape where people vanished every day, and were rarely found unless they wanted to be. Michael Carter gave one interview to the local paper, the Register Herald, on March 15th. He told the reporter that Susan had been planning to leave for weeks, that she'd been unhappy, that he'd tried to make it work. He said he hoped she was safe wherever she was. He said he missed his daughter. The article ran on page 6. A small story, easy to miss. The headline read, "Beckley woman. Daughter missing after apparent departure." Margaret Hayes kept calling police, kept filing requests for updates, kept driving through Beckley and the surrounding counties, stopping at gas stations and motel, showing people photos of Susan and Natasha. No one had seen them. The silver Honda Accord had vanished as completely as its occupants, and Michael Carter within 2 weeks stopped answering Margaret's calls. By April 2000, the case was filed as a voluntary disappearance. The detectives assigned to it, overworked and under-resourced, moved on to new cases, domestic assaults, drug busts, the daily grind of small-town law enforcement. Susan and Natasha became names in a file, faces in a database, memories that for most of Beckley began to fade. But Margaret never stopped looking, and in the back of her mind, a single thought repeated itself like a drumbeat. She wouldn't leave the bear. Capital 4. Busque desistentes. March 2000 bled into April, with no sign of Susan or Natasha Carter. The mountains around Beckley remained cold. The morning still touched with frost, and the silver Honda Accord seemed to have dissolved into the vast American road system, like smoke into air. Margaret Hayes refused to accept the police department's passive stance. If they wouldn't search, she would. On March the 16th, 4 days after the disappearance, Margaret organized the first volunteer search. She printed 500 flyers at Kinko's in Princeton using her credit card and draining what little savings she had. The flyers showed 2 photographs. Susan, smiling faintly in a photo taken the previous Christmas, and Natasha, her school picture from fall 1999, wearing a purple sweater and holding a hesitant smile. Beneath the photos, missing Susan Carter, 41, and Natasha Carter, 10. Last seen March 12, 2000. Beckley, WV, Silver, 1998, Honda Accord. License, WV4729L. Contact Beckley PD or Margaret Hayes. Margaret's husband Frank helped her tape flyers to telephone poles, gas station bulletin boards, the windows of convenience stores. They drove through Beckley, through Oak Hill, through Princeton and Bluefield, covering a 50-meter radius. Everywhere they stopped, Margaret asked the same questions. Have you seen this woman? This little girl? This car? The answers were always the same. No, sorry, no. At the Beckley Police Department, Detective Roy Caldwell was assigned the case. He was 48 years old, a career cop with thinning hair, and a perpetual look of exhaustion. He'd worked homicides, drug cases, domestic disputes, the full spectrum of small-town crime. The Carter disappearance landed on his desk with a note from his supervisor. Probable voluntary departure. Low priority. Caldwell read the file, reviewed Officer Trent's initial report, examined the note Susan had allegedly left. He knew the statistics. Most missing persons cases involving adults who left notes were exactly what they appeared to be. People starting over. But something about this one felt incomplete. The toy bear left behind, the makeup bag in the bathroom, the sister's insistence that Susan would never leave without contacting her. On March the 18th, Caldwell drove to the trailer park on Dry Branch Road and knocked on the door of Lot 14. Michael Carter answered, wearing sweatpants and a flannel shirt, a beer in his hand. Though it was only 10:00 a.m., he let Caldwell inside without resistance. The trailer was messier than Officer Trent had described. Empty beer cans lined the kitchen counter. Dishes sat unwashed in the sink. The air smelled stale, like cigarette smoke and old food. Caldwell sat at the small kitchen table, while Michael leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Mr. Carter," Caldwell began, pulling out a notebook. "I need to ask you some questions about your wife's disappearance." Michael shrugged. "Already told the other cop everything." "I know, but I'd like to hear it again." Michael sighed, then recounted the same story. He'd left Sunday morning to help Ray Dawkins with his truck. When he came home around 3:00 p.m., Susan and Natasha were gone. He found the note. He assumed Susan had finally made good on her threats to leave. "Threats?" Caldwell asked, writing. "She'd been saying for months she wanted out, said she was unhappy, said I didn't treat her right." Michael's voice was flat, emotionless. "Did you? Did I what? Treat her right?" Michael's jaw tightened. "I gave her a roof, food. I didn't cheat, didn't run around. If that wasn't enough, that's on her." Caldwell let the silence hang. Then neighbors reported hearing arguments, loud ones, things breaking. "We argued. So what? Every couple argues. Some neighbors said they heard your wife crying. Your daughter too." Michael's face hardened. "You accusing me of something? I'm trying to understand what happened. I already told you what happened." "She left." Caldwell made a note, then changed direction. "Where were you between 10 a.m. and 3:00 p.m. on March 12th? Ray Dawkins' place." "Like I said, can he confirm that?" "Yeah, call him." Caldwell did. Later that afternoon, he drove to Ray Dawkins' house, a sagging structure with a yard full of car parts and old appliances. Rye, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag, confirmed Michael's story without hesitation. Michael had arrived around 10:30 a.m. and stayed until about 3 p.m. They'd worked on the transmission, drank some beers, talked about football. Ray even showed Caldwell the Chevy Silverado, its transmission still partially disassembled on the driveway. "He seemed upset that day," Caldwell asked. Ray shrugged. "Nah, same as always. Didn't mention his wife leaving till he was about to head out. Said something like, 'Susan's probably got dinner going.' That's it." Caldwell noted everything. The timeline was tight, but plausible. If Susan had left the 7-Eleven at 10:31 a.m., and Michael had been at Ray's by 10:30, there wasn't much overlap unless Michael had done something before going to Ray's. But that didn't fit the evidence. The 7-Eleven footage showed Susan alive and driving at 10:31. Michael's truck had been seen at Ray's by a neighbor who'd passed by around 10:45 a.m. The alibi held. Caldwell returned to the station and wrote up his findings. Subject Michael Carter has confirmed alibi for time of disappearance. Witness Ray Dawkins corroborates no physical evidence of foul play at residence. Note indicates voluntary departure. He filed the report, but the unease didn't leave him. Something about Michael Carter's demeanor, the flatness, the lack of concern bothered him. But gut feelings didn't build cases. By late March, Margaret Hayes had recruited a dozen volunteers, friends, church members, co-workers from the hospital where she worked as a nurse. They organized weekend searches, combing the roads between Beckley and the state borders, checking rest stops, motel, campgrounds. They walked the banks of the New River, searching for any sign of the silver Honda. They found nothing. No tire tracks, no debris, no witnesses who remembered seeing a woman and child matching the descriptions. On March 25th, Margaret drove to the 7-Eleven on Harper Road and spoke with Derek Palmer, the clerk who'd sold Susan cigarettes and Skittles. Derek remembered her clearly. He described how nervous Susan had seemed, how her hands trembled when she took the change. Margaret asked if he'd seen anyone following Susan, anyone watching her. Derek shook his head. She was alone, he said, just her and the little girl in the back seat. Did she say anything where she was going? No, ma'am, just paid and left. Margaret asked if he'd told the police this. Derek said no one had asked. She wrote down his contact information and gave it to Detective Caldwell the next day. Caldwell added it to the file, but didn't follow up immediately. He was juggling 3 other cases, including a homicide in Oak Hill. The Carter case, officially a missing person without evidence of crime, kept sliding down the priority list. In early April, Margaret requested Susan's bank records. The last transaction was the $180 withdrawal on March 10th, the tax refund. Since then, nothing. No ATM withdrawals, no debit card purchases, no checks cashed. Susan's account sat untouched, $43,117 remaining. For someone supposedly starting a new life, she was leaving no financial trail. Margaret brought this to Caldwell's attention. If she's alive and on the run, how is she buying food? Gas? Where is she staying? Caldwell had no answer. Maybe she had cash we don't know about. She had $240. I know because she told me that's not enough to disappear for a month. People live on less. Margaret's voice rose. My sister wouldn't just vanish. Something happened to her. Caldwell closed the file on his desk. Mrs. Tay, I understand your frustration, but without evidence of a crime, there's only so much we can do. We've checked hospitals, shelters, bus stations. We've entered her information into national databases. If she's out there and wants to be found, she'll turn up. And if she doesn't want to be found, then there's nothing we can do. Margaret left the police station that day, feeling hollow. She sat in her car in the parking lot and cried, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. Frank found her there 20 minutes later and drove her home. By May 2000, media interest had evaporated. The Register Herald ran one follow-up article on page 8. Beckley mother, daughter still missing. After 2 months, it mentioned the volunteer searches, Margaret's tireless efforts, and the police department's assertion that the case remained open. But the article also quoted an unnamed source within the department, saying, all indications suggest Mrs. Carter left voluntarily. The article ran on May 12th. No one called with new information. In June, Margaret made the decision to hire a private investigator. His name was Leonard Walsh, a former state trooper in his 60s who now ran a small agency out of Charleston. He charged $75 an hour plus expenses. Margaret and Frank mortgaged their house to pay him. Walsh spent 3 weeks on the case. He arraigned Michael Carter, who refused to let him inside the trailer, and answered questions through a half-open door. He spoke with Ray Dawkins, Carol Jenkins, Derek Palmer, and teachers at Beckley Elementary. He reviewed phone records. Susan's cell phone had been turned off or destroyed shortly after the disappearance, its last ping near a cell tower on Route 3 eastbound at 10:47 a.m. on March 12th. After that, silence. Walsh's final report, delivered to Margaret in early July, was bleak. No evidence of foul play, no witnesses to abduction or violence. Subject's vehicle has not been located despite NCIC alerts. Financial records show no activity. Conclusion: subject either deceased or living off-grid intentionally. Recommend continued monitoring of databases and periodic media appeals. Margaret read the report in her kitchen, Frank's hand on her shoulder. When she finished, she set it down and stared out the window at the trees behind their house. She's not living off-grid, Margaret said quietly. She's dead. Frank didn't argue. By the end of 2000, the volunteer searches had stopped. People returned to their lives. The flyers faded on telephone poles, their ink bleeding in the rain until they were torn down or covered by new advertisements. Detective Caldwell moved on to other cases. The Carter file sat in a cabinet at the Beckley Police Department, marked open, inactive. Margaret continued alone. Every few months, she'd drive to Beckley and walk through the areas Susan might have gone. She'd stop at gas stations, show the photos, ask if anyone had seen them. The answers were always the same. No. Sorry. No. In 2001, Margaret convinced the local TV station WVA to run a segment on the 1-year anniversary of the disappearance. The segment aired on March 12, 2001 at 6 p.m. It showed photos of Susan and Natasha, an interview with Margaret pleading for information, and a brief statement from the Beckley Police Department saying the case remained open. The tip line received 4 calls. 3 were pranks. One was a woman who thought she'd seen Susan at a Walmart in Tennessee, but the woman turned out to be someone else. In 2002, on the 2-year anniversary, no media outlet covered the story. Margaret stood alone at a vigil she'd organized at the Raleigh County Courthouse, holding a candle and a sign with Susan and Natasha's photos. 5 people attended. It rained. On April 15, 2002, Detective Caldwell officially reclassified the case. The new designation, cold case, presumed voluntary departure. The file was moved to a storage room in the basement of the police station, boxed with dozens of other unsolved cases. Caldwell retired 6 months later. In his final week, he pulled the Carter file one last time and read through it page by page. He still didn't believe Susan had left willingly, but belief wasn't evidence. He closed the file, placed it back in the box, and walked away. Michael Carter, meanwhile, continued living in the trailer on Dry Branch Road. He collected his disability checks, drank at Smokeoki's bar, and rarely spoke about his missing wife and daughter. When people asked, he'd say the same thing. She left, that's all I know. In 2003, he started dating a woman named Brenda Kowalski, a waitress at the diner on Harper Road. By 2004, she'd moved into the trailer with him. By 2005, they were married. Brenda never asked about Susan, and Michael never offered. Carol Jenkins, the neighbor who'd seen Susan leave that Sunday morning, moved away in 2006. Before she left, she stopped by Margaret's house in Princeton and gave her a hug. "I wish I'd done more," Carol said, her eyes wet. "I should have called someone. Should have made them listen." Margaret held her hand. "You did what you could," but neither of them believed it. By 2010, a decade after the disappearance, Susan and Natasha Carter were names that most people in Beckley had forgotten. The trailer park on Dry Branch Road had been sold and demolished, replaced by a storage facility. Michael Carter had moved to a small house on the outskirts of town. He was 54 years old, grayer, heavier, his back pain worse. He rarely left the house. Margaret Hayes, now 58, still kept Susan and Natasha's photos on her mantel. Every March 12th, she lit a candle. Every year she called the Beckley Police Department and asked if there were any updates. Every year, the answer was the same. No, sorry, no. In 2015, Margaret was diagnosed with breast cancer. She underwent treatment, surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. She survived, but it left her weaker, slower. Frank retired to care for her. They talked sometimes about Susan, about Natasha, about what might have happened. But the conversations always ended the same way. In silence, in grief, in the terrible not knowing. Margaret never stopped believing her sister was out there somewhere waiting to be found. She just didn't think she'd live long enough to see it. And for 24 years, it seemed she was right. The case files gathered dust. The missing person reports remained in databases, flagged but inactive. The silver Honda Accord, registered to Susan Marie Carter, was listed in stolen vehicle registries from coast to coast. Alerts went out every year, automatically generated by computer systems. But no one was actively looking until October 2024, when a backhoe blade struck metal beneath the red clay of an old coal loading site, and the earth finally gave up what it had been hiding. The years between 2000 and 2024 moved like water over stone, slowly, steadily, eroding memory until only the hardest edges remained. Susan and Natasha Carter became ghosts in Beckley's collective consciousness. Names mentioned occasionally in true crime forums online. Faces on outdated missing person websites that no one visited anymore. The world moved on. Technology advanced. The coal mines closed one by one. The trailer park on Dry Branch Road was bulldozed and paved over. And beneath it all, 3FT under red Appalachian clay, a silver Honda Accord sat undisturbed. Michael Carter aged into a reclusive old man. By 2020, he was 64 years old, his back permanently bent from the mining injury that had never properly healed. His second wife, Brenda, left him in 2018 after 14 years of marriage, citing his drinking, his temper, his refusal to talk about anything that mattered. He lived alone in a small rental house on the eastern edge of Beckley, surviving on disability checks and occasional odd jobs. He rarely went out, except to buy beer and cigarettes at the corner store. Neighbors described him as unfriendly, curt, the kind of man who kept his blinds closed and his past locked away. Margaret Hayes turned 70 in 2022. The breast cancer had returned twice, each time beaten back by treatments that left her weaker. Frank had died in 2019 from a heart attack, and she lived alone now in the house they'd shared for 43 years. Susan and Natasha's photos still sat on the mantel, faded but unmoved. Every March 12th, she lit a candle. Every year, the flame burned alone. She no longer called the police. There was no point. The case had been cold for over 2 decades, and the detectives who'd worked it were retired or dead. The new generation of officers didn't know the name Susan Carter or Natasha Carter. To them, the case was a file in a basement, a database entry that generated automated alerts no one read. But Margaret never stopped believing. In the quiet of her living room, in the long evenings when grief felt heaviest, she'd talk to Susan as if her sister could hear. "I haven't forgotten you. I'll never forget you." October 2024 arrived cold and grey. The construction project on the eastern edge of Beckley, the site of the old coal loading station, had been delayed for months by permits, environmental reviews, and budget overruns. But finally, on October 8th, the crew began excavation. The site was slated to become a shopping plaza, a promise of economic revitalization in a town that had lost its backbone when the coal industry collapsed. Tommy Briggs, the excavator operator, was 34 years old, a Beckley native who'd worked construction since dropping out of high school. He knew the area well, had played in the abandoned rail yards as a kid, knew the stories about the old loading station, the men who'd worked there, the coal that had once poured through like black gold. Now it was just dirt and weeds waiting to be scraped clean and rebuilt. At 8:52 a.m., his back hose blade hit something solid. The metallic clang echoed across the site. Briggs stopped thinking he'd struck an old rail tie or buried machinery. But when he climbed down and brushed away the clay, he saw paint. Silver, automotive paint. And beneath the mud, the unmistakable shape of a license plate. His first thought was that someone had dumped a stolen car decades ago. It happened. But when he called his foreman and they began carefully excavating around the vehicle, the shape that emerged was wrong. The car wasn't wrecked. It was positioned horizontally, deliberately placed in a trench and buried. The roof was crushed, but not from impact, from the weight of earth pressing down over years. By 10 a.m., the West Virginia State Police had arrived. By noon, the site was a crime scene. The forensic team worked slowly, methodically. They couldn't simply yank the vehicle out with chains. Too much risk of destroying evidence. Instead, they used hydraulic jacks, lifted it inch by inch, documented every layer of soil, every position of debris. The license plate was photographed in situ, then carefully cleaned. WV47029L. A records check came back within minutes. Registered to Susan Marie Carter. Reported missing March 12th or 12th, 2000. The lead investigator, Detective Megan Cross, was 38 years old, a state police detective who'd transferred to the cold case unit 2 years prior. She'd never heard of Susan Carter, but when she pulled the file from the archives that afternoon, she found herself staring at a case that had been buried, literally and figuratively, for nearly a quarter century. The Honda Accord was transported to the State Forensic Lab in Charleston on October 10th. The examination took 3 days. What they found confirmed the worst. 2 sets of skeletal remains. The adult in the driver's seat, the child in the back. Clothing fragments still clung to the bones. Denim, synthetic fabric, the remnants of a floral print blouse. The wedding ring on the adult's left hand was photographed, catalogued, and compared to photos from the original case file. It matched Susan Carter's ring in the back seat, beneath layers of sediment that had seeped through rusted seams over decades. They found the pink backpack. The nylon was rotted, but the name stitched in purple thread was still legible. Natasha. Inside a small notebook filled with pencil drawings of horses, the pages swollen and stuck together and tucked into a corner. A stuffed bear, its fur matted with clay, but unmistakable Charlie. DNA samples were taken from the remains, teeth, bone marrow, femur fragments. They were compared to samples Margaret Hayes had provided in 2000, stored in the case file for exactly this purpose. The results came back on October 15th. Match probability 99.97%. The remains were Susan Marie Carter and Natasha Lynn Carter, but it was the mechanical analysis that turned the case from tragedy to murder. The rear doors of the Honda Accord had been welded shut from the outside. Crude welds done hastily, but effectively. The forensic engineer who examined them noted in his report, "Weld consistent with industrial welding equipment. Doors cannot be opened from inside indicates intentional containment." The front door showed signs of forced closure. The driver's side lock mechanism had been jimmied, then reinforced with wire. The windows were intact, but couldn't be rolled down. The electrical system had been disabled by cutting specific wires under the dashboard. The final piece, soil analysis. The clay surrounding the vehicle contained traces of diesel fuel and heavy machinery lubricant. Isotope dating placed the burial between March and April 2000. Consistent with the disappearance timeline, Someone with access to an excavator or backhoe had dug the trench, placed the vehicle inside, and buried it. Then they'd let nature do the rest, covering it with kudzu saplings, 24 years of silence. On October 18, 2024, Detective Cross drove to Princeton and knocked on Margaret Hayes' door. Margaret opened it slowly, her face pale and thin, her hands trembling. When Cross introduced herself and showed her badge, Margaret's legs nearly gave out. She knew before Cross said a word. She knew. "We found them," Cross said quietly. Margaret's hand went to her mouth. She didn't cry. Not yet. She just nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd always suspected. "Where?" she whispered. "Beckley, buried at an old industrial site." "How long?" "Since 2000. They've been there the whole time." Margaret sat down on her porch step. Cross sat beside her. For a long time, neither spoke. The October wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of wood smoke and cold rain. Finally, Margaret found her voice. "I knew she didn't leave. I knew." "Yes, ma'am. How did they die?" Cross hesitated. "We're still investigating, but it wasn't an accident." Margaret looked at her, eyes hard despite the tears beginning to fall. "It was Michael, wasn't it? We're investigating all leads. It was him." Margaret's voice was certain, cold. It was always him. The news broke nationally on October 20th. CNN, Fox, MSNBC. Every major outlet ran the story. 24-year-old cold case solved. Bodies of missing West Virginia. Mother and daughter found buried. Beckley was thrust back into the spotlight. And this time, the community reacted with shock and horror. The silver Honda Accord, photographed covered in rust and clay, became an image seared into the public consciousness. On social media, old classmates of Natasha's posted tributes. Former neighbors expressed guilt for not speaking up decades ago. And in the quiet corners of true crime forums, where Susan and Natasha's case had been discussed for years by amateur investigators, there was grim validation. They'd been right. It had never been a voluntary disappearance. Detective Cross assembled a task force. The case file from 2000 was pulled, digitized, and reviewed with modern investigative techniques. Every witness was recounted, every piece of evidence re-examined. And at the top of the suspect list, circled in red, was a name that had been there from the beginning. Michael Joseph Carter, October 22nd, 2024. The West Virginia State Police Headquarters in Charleston became the nerve center of an investigation that had waited 24 years to begin in earnest. Detective Megan Cross sat in a windowless conference room, walls covered with printouts, photographs, and a timeline that stretched from March 2000 to the present. Across from her sat forensic analysts, state prosecutors, and a young FBI liaison assigned to provide technical support. On the whiteboard behind them, written in blue marker, Michael Joseph Carter, primary suspect. The evidence chain was being built methodically. The 2000 case file provided the foundation, Michael's history of domestic violence, the neighbors' reports of shouting and crying, the suspiciously convenient alibi. But alibis from 2000 needed to be re-examined with fresh eyes. Cross dispatched 2 investigators to locate Ray Dawkins. The man who claimed Michael was at his house working on a truck the morning Susan and Natasha disappeared. They found him in a nursing home in Oak Hill, 71 years old, confined to a wheelchair after a stroke 3 years prior. His memory was spotty, but when investigators showed him photos from 2000 and asked about March 12th, his eyes grew distant. "Michael Carter," he said slowly. "Yeah, I remember. He came by that morning." "What time?" Ray hesitated. "I don't know. It was a long time ago." "The report says 10:30 a.m. Does that sound right?" Ray's face clouded. "Maybe. Or maybe it was later. Hell, I don't remember. I was drunk half the time back then." The investigator leaned forward. "Ray, this is important. Could Michael have arrived later than 10:30? Say noon?" Ray looked at his hands, gnarled and trembling. "Could have been. I wasn't keeping time. The statement was recorded. It wasn't enough to break the alibi completely, but it introduced doubt. If Michael hadn't arrived until noon, there was a 4-hour window between Susan leaving the 7-Eleven at 10:31 a.m. and Michael showing up at Ray's house. 4 hours was plenty of time. Back in Charleston, forensic teams focused on the vehicle itself. The welds on the rear doors were analyzed under electron microscopy. The metallurgical composition matched industrial welding rods commonly used in construction and demolition work. Cross pulled Michael Carter's employment records from 2000. In March of that year, he'd been unemployed, collecting disability, but records showed he'd worked briefly in 1999 for a company called Tri-State Demolition, operating heavy machinery. Cross contacted the company, now defunct, but with archived records stored in a Charleston warehouse. After 2 days of searching through boxes of invoices and equipment logs, they found something. On March 14, 2000, 2 days after Susan and Natasha disappeared, Michael Carter had rented a Caterpillar backhoe for personal use. The rental agreement was signed in his handwriting. The machine was returned on March 16th, covered in red clay. Cross photographed the document, her hand steady, but her heart racing. This was the link they needed. Soil samples from the burial site were compared to samples taken from the trailer park on Dry Branch Road, where Michael had lived in 2000. The clay composition was identical. Geologists testified that the specific mineral content, high in iron oxide, low in calcium carbonate, was consistent with soil found in a narrow band of Raleigh County, including both the burial site and the trailer park location. On October 28th, Cross obtained a search warrant for Michael Carter's current residence, a small rental house on Baker Street in Beckley. The entry team arrived at 6 Mount AM battering ram ready, but Michael opened the door before they could use it. He stood in the doorway in boxer shorts and a stained undershirt, grey hair, disheveled, eyes blurry. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. "Michael Joseph Carter. We have a warrant to search this property." He didn't resist. He stood on the front lawn in bare feet, while officers moved through his house, methodically photographing and cataloguing. In the garage, buried under tarps and old paint cans, they found a metal toolbox. Inside, a welding mask, gloves stained with old burn marks, and a spool of welding wire. The wire's composition matched the welds on the Honda Accord's doors. Michael was brought to the station for questioning that afternoon. He sat in interview room 2, a cramped space with cinder block walls painted beige and a metal table bolted to the floor. Detective Cross sat across from him, a file folder in front of her. Michael's public defender, a weary man in his 50s named Dale Fitzpatrick, sat beside him. Cross opened the folder and placed a photograph on the table. The silver Honda Accord, rusted and caked in clay, being lifted from the excavation site. "Recognize this?" Cross asked. Michael glanced at it, then away. "That's Susan's car. We found it on October 8th, buried at the old coal loading site on East Main." Michael said nothing. Cross placed another photo. The skeletal remains in the driver's seat. "That's your wife, Mr. Carter. Susan. And in the back seat, we found your daughter Natasha." Michael's face didn't change. He stared at the photo, jaw tight, then leaned back in his chair. "I didn't know they were there. Didn't know, or didn't remember. I didn't know." Cross placed the rental agreement on the table. "March 14th, 2000, you rented a backhoe. What was it for?" Michael's eyes flicked to his lawyer. Fitzpatrick leaned over, whispered something. Michael shook his head. "I don't remember." "You don't remember renting heavy machinery 2 days after your wife and daughter disappeared? It was 24 years ago." Cross pulled out another document. The welding equipment receipt. "You bought welding supplies in January 2000 pod. What were you welding?" "I did odd jobs. Fixed things like car doors." Michael's hands resting on the table curled into fists. "I want a lawyer." "You have a lawyer. A better one." The interview ended. Michael was released pending further investigation, but Cross knew they were close. The forensic evidence was piling up. The rental agreement, the welding equipment, the soil match, all circumstantial, but together they formed a narrative. On November 3rd, forensic analysts made a breakthrough. Inside the Honda's trunk, beneath layers of sediment, they found fabric fibers. The fibers were analyzed and matched to work gloves commonly used in demolition and construction. DNA extracted from skin cells on the fibers came back with a profile male. The profile was compared to a sample taken from Michael Carter during the search warrant execution. Match probability, 99.8%. Cross stood in the lab staring at the report and felt the weight of 24 years pressing down. Susan and Natasha had been crying out from beneath the earth, and finally someone was listening. On November 12, 2024, Michael Joseph Carter was arrested at his home. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and 1 count of abuse of a corpse. The arrest made national headlines. Video footage showed Michael, now 68 years old, being led from his house in handcuffs, his face blank. Reporters shouting questions he didn't answer. Margaret Hayes watched the arrest on the news from her living room in Princeton. She sat alone, hands folded in her lap, and wept. Not from relief. Relief would come later, if at all, but from the terrible confirmation that everything she'd believed for 24 years was true. Her sister hadn't abandoned her. She'd been murdered, and the man who'd done it had walked free, had remarried, had lived a life while Susan and Natasha lay sealed in darkness. The trial began on February the 10th, 2025 in Raleigh County Circuit Court. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the gallery. Margaret sat in the front row, clutching a photo of Susan and Natasha, her hands trembling. Michael sat at the defense table wearing an ill-fitting suit, his face expressionless. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Prosecutor Ellen Vargas, built their case methodically. On day 1, they presented the timeline. Susan and Natasha last seen at the 7-Eleven at 10:31 a.m. Michael's alibi uncertain, potentially arriving at Ray Dawkins' house as late as noon. 4-hour window of opportunity. On day 2, forensic experts testified. The welds on the car doors, the soil analysis, the DNA on the work gloves. Each piece of evidence was displayed on screens for the jury, photographs blown up, technical language translated into plain terms. The medical examiner testified that the remains showed no signs of blunt force trauma, suggesting asphyxiation or carbon monoxide poisoning. The car's exhaust system had been jury-rigged, with a hose feeding fumes into the sealed interior. The courtroom fell silent. Margaret covered her mouth, stifling a sob. On day 5, the prosecution called Carol Jenkins via video link, now 78 and living in Florida. She testified about the bruises she'd seen on Susan, the fear in Natasha's eyes the morning she'd waved goodbye as Susan drove away. "I should have stopped her," Carol said, her voice breaking. "I should have known." On day 7, Margaret took the stand. She spoke about Susan's plans to leave, the $240 in cash, the duffel bag hidden in the trunk. She described the phone call 2 weeks before the disappearance. Susan's voice trembling as she said, "I just need 2 more weeks." Margaret's voice was steady until the prosecutor asked her about Natasha's stuffed bear, the one left behind on the bed. Then she broke, tears streaming, and the judge called a recess. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Michael had rented the backhoe for legitimate work, that the DNA could have been transferred innocently, that the prosecution was building a case on coincidence and tragedy, not proof beyond reasonable doubt. But on day 9, the prosecution played their final card. Investigators had obtained Michael's cell phone records from March 2000 archived by the carrier. On March 12th, his phone had pinged off a cell tower near the burial site at 11:47 a.m., directly contradicting his claim that he was at Ray Dawkins' house by 10:30. The defense had no answer. On February 24, 2025, after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom stood as the foreman read the verdict. Count 1, murder in the first degree in the death of Susan Marie Carter. Guilty. Margaret's breath caught. Count 2, murder in the first degree in the death of Natasha Lynn Carter. Guilty. She closed her eyes. Count 3, kidnapping. Guilty. Count 4, kidnapping. Guilty. Count 5, abuse of a corpse. Guilty. Michael Carter sat motionless. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but Michael didn't react. He stared straight ahead, as if the verdict had been delivered to someone else. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judith Harmon, addressed the court. "Mr. Carter, you were entrusted with the safety and well-being of your wife and daughter. Instead, you ended their lives and buried them like refuse. You robbed them of their futures. You robbed their family of closure for 24 years. The law allows me only one sentence for crimes of this magnitude." She looked directly at Michael. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole consecutive on both murder counts. The gavel struck. Michael was led away. He didn't look back. Outside the courthouse, Margaret stood on the steps, surrounded by reporters. She held the photo of Susan and Natasha, the same one she'd carried for 24 years. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but firm. "Justice doesn't heal. It doesn't bring them back. But it tells the world that they mattered, that their lives had value, and that the person who took them from us will never walk free again." She paused, looking at the photo. "Susan, Natasha, you can rest now." March 12th, 2025. 25 years to the day after Susan and Natasha Carter disappeared, Margaret Hayes stood at a cemetery in Princeton. 2 headstones, simple granite, had been placed side by side. Susan Marie Carter, 1959-2000. Natasha Lynn Carter, 1990-2000. Beneath the names beloved sister, daughter, mother. Finally home. Margaret placed flowers on each grave, daisies for Susan, her favorite, and a small toy horse for Natasha. She knelt in the grass, her knees stiff with age, and touched the cold stone. I never stopped looking, she whispered. I never gave up. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of early spring. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang. Margaret stayed until the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cemetery. Then she stood slowly and walked back to her car. She didn't look back. There was no need. They were home, and the earth, after 24 years, had finally let them go.